So I thought we'd talk a little bit about why you should be interested, like what's the point of qualitative research, why do we care what it is, and then so we'll talk about that a little bit, about when it would be appropriate, when it would be useful, and then I have a bunch of different slides that we can spend more or less time on depending your interests, about different aspects of building a qualitative research project, the concept of rigor in qualitative research. And then I put a whole bunch of slides at the end, just for your future reference that we won't cover, but they're just short descriptions of various qualitative methodologies with some kind of key authors who write about that methodology and an example of what a question might look like that would be appropriate for that methodology, because that's one of the, I think, something that's useful for people to understand, but not at this kind of first or, one of the first exposures. So I think the slides are going to be on the drive. Yeah, so they'll be available if you ever want to come back to that. Okay, so what's the point of qualitative research? Why would we even bother to learn how to do this? This is a question when I teach the HRM, the health research methodology, which is all super quantitative thinkers. We always start out with this, and I always seem to be like, yeah, finally, somebody's asking us, why do we care about this? Well, I care about it. And I care about it because qualitative and quantitative, they're not different ways of asking the same question. They're two different approaches that ask completely different questions. So qualitative would be absolutely inappropriate to answer a question about drug efficacy or safety of a particular technology. It is undeniable that qualitative would be an inferior approach to answer those type of questions. But similarly, quantitative can't answer a lot of the questions that we approach in qualitative. You have a very hard time using a quantitative approach to answer questions about somebody's experience, about social interactions in organizations and how people experience and operate in the world, which tend to be the questions that we address with qualitative approaches. So you might find qualitative research to be a helpful approach if your research concerns something that can't be measured. And this sounds introductory, but there's a lot of people that try to measure sort of vague, nebulous, undefined concepts and then get really frustrated because they're hard to measure. Maybe we'll start with a different way of looking at it. Or if you're interested in the opinions or the experiences or the beliefs of your participants, that's a good type of a project that you might want to use a qualitative approach. Likewise, sometimes you have a question, but you're not really sure what factors are relevant to that question, to answer that question, or what's important, and so qualitative can be a nice entree into a new topic where you don't really know what the relevant issues at play are. Or when the boundaries and the parameters of your question are still quite broad and you need to sort of explore that phenomenon or that question because it hasn't been explored before in the literature, and this is sort of a first foray into that topic. So some questions that qualitative research might ask, here's a few examples. And if, for those of you who are experienced quantitative researchers, you might, in your mind, be like, oh, well, we could use this measure and that measure. So we would be approaching these in different ways, but we might look for broad questions that have a lot of different influences, a lot of different factors, a lot of different things at play, like, why don't patients take the medications as they're prescribed? Or how do physicians develop good clinical judgment? Or what makes a particular clinical teaching unit a good place to learn, an effective place to learn? Oftentimes, qualitative and quantitative approaches can be used together. So sometimes qualitative research can help explain unexpected findings from a quantitative study. So here's an example from this department where Judy Baird and Keena Bracken and Lawrence Grierson did a quantitative survey study with a whole bunch of different measures about the types of power that clinical clerks experienced on their various learning rotations. And at the end of that research, they had this finding that clerks who had more resident preceptors were more likely to experience negative forms of power use and to report lower quality learning experiences. But this kind of posed a really important question that was not able to be answered with that survey, and that is, why? What is it about residents that is associated with these negative forms of power use? So right now, I'm working with these three to do a qualitative study about how clerks experience power in clinical learning environments, and we're observing. So we have research assistants shadowing medical students as they do their clerkship and doing interviews with them to sort of try to suss out what it is about residents, what's happening with negative power, why do they report negative power use when they work more with residents? You know, maybe these things, maybe it's not that the residents are using coercive forms of power. Maybe the residents are such great positive role models that they start to notice negative forms of power from their other preceptors. Like, we don't know from the survey. All we know is that these two things co-occur. So the qualitative research is a good chance to kind of try to sort out what's happening and why we might have had that result from the first study. Qualitative research can also be helpful to identify factors of interest for further study or for intervention. So one project that I did a couple of years ago in the context of a health technology assessment for a new diabetes medication, it was noticed that there's often low levels of adherence, of medication adherence among people who have type 2 diabetes. And so this is a good qualitative question about how do people with type 2 diabetes manage their medications, what are the barriers and facilitators that they experience, which may lead into a future quantitative study about designing an intervention designed to alleviate some of these barriers that we identified, assessing the effectiveness of that intervention, so sort of going back and forth between the two approaches. Also an option, possibility. So does that kind of make sense to you guys about what qualitative is and what some of the sort of main differences between qual and quant are? Does anyone have any questions at this point? No? Can the people online talk to us if they had a question?
They're having trouble hearing us.
Oh.
So I am sorting that out. Apologize.
All right, no problem. Let me know if they need like a special, time to chime in or something.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are some of the main distinctions between qualitative and quantitative research? So these are some of the concepts that are usually associated with one approach or the other approach. So qualitative research can be descriptive and interpretive, both, either one. Uses inductive forms of reasoning and inference, generally more interested in meaning than numbers, focuses on the depth or the uniqueness of the phenomenon rather than trying to find a generalizable knowledge across a bigger group. If we want to get really philosophical and talk about epistemology, qualitative tends to be comfortable with worldviews about the different ways that people experience the world and the different realities that an individual might encounter, as opposed to just kind of assuming that there's one reality, there's one truth, and we all just have to figure out what that is. And we usually aim to develop theory rather than test theory, often interested in processes rather than the outcomes, and we strive for rich descriptions rather than for a precise measurement. So I think we probably don't need too much information about the inferential aims of qualitative research. Are the terms inductive and deductive familiar? So inductive going from the particular to the general, and deductive reasoning going from the general to the particular. So qualitative tends to make observations, look at individual things, and then build a theory from there, whereas deductive research, which is often quantitative, not always, those things don't, align perfectly. But deductive reasoning would be starting with a theory and then testing it to see if it applies to particular examples. So qualitative research tends to use inductive reasoning. We're interested in the ways in which individuals interpret their social world. Often you'll see descriptions and understandings of human behavior. And the goal here is sort of careful and detailed descriptions or interpretations of social practices and how participants experience and explain their own world. I think that last bullet point could describe almost every single qualitative study I've ever read. There's some element of that in there. Yeah, so I'm going to skip over this inductive reasoning thing, but here's my little work of knowledge. Okay. One of the hallmarks of qualitative research is that it's almost always an iterative process. And we kind of accept that you start out with one way of thinking about your question, the phenomenon of interest, but that through the process of your research, as you collect your data, as you analyze it, your understanding of what that phenomenon is and what's important and what's relevant and who you need to talk to is going to be refined. And so your project and your procedures and even your question itself is likely going to shift and be refined as you proceed throughout the research project. So this tends to be like anathema to quantitative research, where you design a really careful protocol and you stick to that and you make sure that there's no deviations and there's no changes. In qualitative research, we understand that this is going to happen, and so when we design projects, we start often very broad, with a really broad question, preparing that it's going to shift in some direction that we can't yet imagine. That when we start to talk to people and we start to understand a little bit more about whatever we're studying, our ideas will shift, and that's going to guide the rest of the project. So here's an example of this, how this could happen. So you might start with a broad question, like what is it like to be on the waiting list for an organ transplant? Like what's the experience of being a person who's waiting for an organ transplant? And so maybe you start by talking to a few people who are currently in that situation, who are currently on a waiting list. And as you analyze those initial interviews, you notice that they tend to be talking about ideas about who deserves an organ, whose priorities, what's the priority of people on the list, how come people are jumping past them on the list, how come they jumped past other people, like how does this prioritization happen? Okay, so this is interesting. So then you say, this seems to be like something that's fruitful and worth exploring, so let's recruit some more patient participants, and we're going to talk to them specifically about these ideas of fairness and equity and prioritization and who deserves what within this context. And of course, when you start asking questions about these ideas, people are talking more about that. So your understanding about these phenomenon gets a little bit clearer. It sort of starts to come into focus a little bit. And as you keep pursuing this question, you notice that people are talking about prioritization and fairness at the same time as they're talking about feelings of guilt. About, I was so upset when somebody, jumped past me and got those lungs that I've been waiting for, but then I thought about all the other people that I probably jumped past. If I'm number 2 now, then who's behind me? Like they're talking about these feelings of guilt. So this is interesting. This is an interesting finding. So then maybe you want to recruit some people who are not on the waiting list, but people who have received organs, and you rework your questions to talk to them about the same issues from that different perspective. And you keep kind of doing this process of talking to people, gathering your data, analyzing your data, thinking about that data in relation to your question and your research interests, thinking about where the holes are, where the gaps are, what other types of data you need to sort of fill in that picture, pursuing that data, gathering that, analyzing it, reflecting it, and your project begins to take shape in this way. Am I blowing your mind? No. We all kind of knew that this is how qualitative happens. Can they hear okay now?
They're just going to watch the recording later.
So with this idea that in qualitative research we refine our questions and our projects through the process of actually doing the research, we need a different way of thinking about sampling, right? And so that's one of the reasons that we don't use the same sampling strategies as quantitative research. Another reason is that we're not striving for the same ends as qualitative researchers are. We're not trying to make a statistically sound inference. We're not trying to have generalizable findings that are generalizable to a particular group. And so therefore our sampling doesn't need to be representative of that group. Rather, like it's important to think about who you want to talk to and who's in and who's out, but it's mostly about who's going to have interesting data, who's going to have relevant data, who's going to be able to really talk about what you want to study. And so we tend to call this purposive sampling, which means looking to find participants who are going to be able to yield rich insights to your project. And sometimes this evolves with your project. So just as your question and your data collection evolves, so does your idea about who has rich insights. So in that example of where we started out talking to people who are waiting for an organ, and then we shifted to people who received an organ, there might be other shifts. We might want to talk to the Trillium Gift of Life Network and the coordinators who are having to decide where people are on the list and what are those criteria and who develops those criteria. Let's talk to policymakers who are working on that issue, like sort of really thinking about whatever your phenomenon is and who would have something relevant to contribute to your understanding of that question. And this is always a little bit tricky when you have to say how many people you're going to talk to, because you don't usually know until you're finished talking to them. So whenever you're writing a grant or you're doing your REB application and they ask, like, how many people do you want to talk to? Well, I don't know. It's like usually a very big ballpark, right? 10 to 50. Most people, like most of the sort of granting agencies in the REB, they have an appreciation of how qualitative works, and so this is acceptable to them. But it's true that you absolutely do not know how many people you're going to need to talk to until you're there. It's usually more than 10, and it's usually less than 100, or probably even less than 60 would be a really big qualitative project. But we can't say, we're going to need to talk to 32 people. Just, you have to decide. And how we figure out what's enough, often, not always, there's different methodologies have sort of a different flavor of this, but the sort of typical way of deciding this is the concept of saturation. So when your data is saturated, that means that collecting new data doesn't yield new ideas about whatever you're studying. That when you talk to more people, their responses are kind of predictable. Like it's ideas, concepts that you've already heard before that kind of fits into your analysis and makes sense with everything else. But of course, how do you determine that? When is that point reached? Like it all changes depending on the project, depending on the methodology, depending on the homogeneity of your participant population, the complexity of the phenomenon that you're studying, the type of theory that you're formulating about how broad that is, if other people, new participants are giving new ideas or not. And so it's hard to tell you how that's going to happen outside of a particular project, but it's, I guess, something that you have a bit of an instinct for once you do it a few times. And I can often ballpark at the beginning of a project how many people we're going to need to talk to, but it's usually like within, plus or minus 15, so it's not, it's not that precise. Does that, questions about sampling and iteration? No, you guys are very quiet. Is this normal?
It's pretty nice.
Yeah. All right.
Nobody's asleep, I think.
Pardon?
Nobody's asleep. Nobody's
Yeah. All right. That's always the bar that I strive
yeah,
for. Nobody falls asleep. We've only had one person leave.
Yeah, and by the way, she had somewhere to go. So, that's all it happens.
All right. So now I have a few slides about what the different parts of the qualitative research project are, and I'll just no further explanation at this point. So the three sort of main parts are the philosophy, so the worldview, the research approach, so the particular methodology, and then your data collection strategy, which are the methods. So often people will say, I did an interview study, or this is going to be a focus group study, or I want it to be an observation study, and those are specific methods. That's not, that doesn't apply to this. We're talking about data collection methods. If we're talking about interviews or focus groups or observations, or I'm going to give them cameras and have them take pictures of their lives and then talk about them, that's a method. And typically those are the last thing that you choose when you're designing a study, not the first. And I'll tell you why. Because this is, I think, the most common, novice qualitative mistake is going right for the methods without thinking about the other stuff. And so when you're building your project, methodology, there tend to be sort of these prepackaged sets of a methodology that comes with a particular sort of philosophical understanding of how the world works and particular methods. And you can do some mixing and matching to a certain extent, because often there's some some flexibility there. There's different data collection methods that fit with different methodologies. But they have to be justified, because there's definitely some ways that you could put these different pieces together that will be incongruent, or they wouldn't fit properly. And some of the techniques tend to be used together quite frequently. There's sort of like a pre-packaged set of ideas, but some are in philosophical opposition. So as a building metaphor, you can think of a screw, right? So a screw works with a screwdriver and a screw works with a drill. These are two different, ways of applying a screw, and both of them are fine and both of them are going to work. But what's not going to work with a screw is a hammer. So this is sort of the idea of mix and match. There's some things that go together, but there's some things that are just not going to fit together. And you need to be careful, but this is, I guess, something if you're new to qualitative, that you would seek guidance from someone who's more experienced, or do some reading to kind of figure out what doesn't fit. It's not something you would be expected to just be able to ascertain from having a novice level of familiarity. So the tendency is to start with the methods for people who are a little bit newer to qualitative research. So they might just say, like, let's do a focus group study about this, right? Like, I have a question about help-seeking behaviors for low-income men who have depression. So let's do a focus group study and figure this out. But that's kind of like saying, let's use a wrench. There's so many different types of wrenches, it's not meaningful to say, hey, I need some work done on my house. Can you come and help me? Casey, can you come over on Saturday and help me with these problems I have? And, bring a wrench. Probably the wrench that you would pick would not be the one that I would need, because maybe it's my car that's having troubles, not the plumbing, and, it's just not specific enough. Because focus groups, like interviews, like any of the other methods, there's a whole bunch of different flavors to them. You can use that data collection method in a variety of different ways to fit better with your methodology and your sort of worldview philosophy package. So you have to be careful that these are all going to fit together to accomplish the goals that you want to accomplish. And this is, if we're thinking about sort of like a conceptual hierarchy of what governs what, this would be the order. So the philosophy, the worldview is the biggest, and that kind of trickles down to govern what methodologies fit there, and then there's particular methods that fit with those methodologies. So that's kind of the order, the hierarchy. So I keep kind of alluding to the philosophy or the worldview, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to describe this. So here are some of the words that you might have heard before, or maybe not, but people kind of use interchangeably. They're not precisely interchangeable, but for the sake of today, this is fine. But what we're really meaning is a package of understanding about what exists in the world, what can be known about what exists in that world, and how we can know it. And this is the foundation of all research. So if you've ever encountered philosophy of science before, about how do we generate knowledge and what knowledge is authoritative and that kind of stuff, this is what we're talking about. So this isn't specific to qualitative research. It's just that quantitative tends to stay in one corner of this knowledge, so they don't really worry about the other options. Qualitative has a lot more options within this category, so they tend to think and talk and read and discuss about it a lot more. So quantitative research absolutely has a paradigm. Absolutely they have an ontology and an epistemology, but they all tend to be in sort of the post-positivist corner, so they don't really worry about the other options. If that makes sense. If you're interested in reading more, here are some sources. This middle one, the Grix reading, is really accessible and quite clear and very helpful. So if this is something that you're interested in dipping your toe into, I would recommend that you start with that one. The one at the top, Mita's book, is a little bit more advanced, but really thorough and comprehensive, very helpful. And then this is sort of an old classic at the end that kind of gets into some of the controversies in this idea. Okay, so that's the top one, the worldview. In the middle, we have the methodology, and so this is your package of guidelines for conducting research. Each methodology tends to be affiliated with a particular worldview. Each comes with guidelines for collecting data, for sampling, for analyzing your data, and they've all been developed out of different disciplines, so they each tend to have different focus, different theories that inform them, and the slides that I parked at the end of this deck are different examples of methodologies if you want to see some examples. But for now, we could say that if you're choosing a methodology, you want to make sure that it's aligned with the research question that you ask. And so often this is sort of an iterative process itself of choosing a research methodology, that you probably have a question, so then you could look for methodology that would help you fit that. And when you start to learn about methodologies, you might refine your question a little bit to make it fit better. And during that process, you might say, okay, that's not a good fit, that's not what I want to do. After all, let's look at this different methodology. But those two pieces need to fit. Those are sort of the most important. Your research question needs to match your methodology. And I know we're never supposed to send anybody to Wikipedia because it's not a good source. But Wikipedia, for many methodologies, is an excellent resource of here's 1,000 words that explains this methodology and gives you the key authors and the key texts if you want to learn more. So if you just need sort of an entrance to what is grounded theory and what does it mean, and is this going to be relevant or helpful at all, for me to invest more time in learning about grounded theory, Wikipedia is a good place to go to kind of make that assessment. And then at the very bottom, we have our methods, which are tools for data collection. So this can include interviews, focus groups, observation, different approaches to analyzing text, various arts-based approaches. There's a whole bunch of arts-based approaches. And they tend to cluster within methodologies. So once you choose your methodology and you learn more about that, it will say, okay, if you're doing a phenomenology study, here are the types of ways that you could collect data. So does this idea of the toolkit of the 3 elements, does it make sense? Does anyone need more reasoning or more convincing about why you shouldn't start with an interview study? Because that's if you remember one thing from today, that's what I want you to remember. No? I've sold you? Okay. All right. So in terms of what you choose first of those 3 elements, there's no, I can't tell you how to make that choice, but some things that you might consider are that you probably already have a worldview of how you understand, what exists and what can be known about that, and it's going to be really hard for you if you choose a methodology that does not align with that. So it's probably worth investigating what your worldview already is, and then learning about the methodologies that fit that way of seeing the world, because otherwise it's just an uphill battle, right? You don't need to do that to yourself. If you're on a team, that might be a little bit more difficult because you'll probably across the team members will have different understandings. Another starting point would be the question that you want to ask or the type of data that's accessible. So maybe you do say, I know we could do some really cool observation about this phenomenon, but I can't call it an observation study, so what different types of methodologies use observation, and let's kind of work backwards from that way. Also okay. Some of us have methodologies that we really, and because I'm the worst example for this, I just love doing grounded theory studies. I try to make everything a grounded theory study. And sometimes you have something that fits that you're comfortable with, and you just start to see research questions that fit that methodology. That methodology fits with the way that you see the world, and so it kind of happens that way as you become more experienced in qualitative research. Or Larkin explained that she does thematic analysis, right? This is something she's comfortable with, and so you tend to gravitate towards those approaches. And so in these slides at the end of the lecture, which I'm not going to go into, the point of them, and if you have a few minutes to just kind of flick through them, to help you understand the variation between the methodologies, to appreciate the influence of the methodology on the type of question that you want to ask. And also just to give you a place to start if you're trying to think about designing a qualitative research project. So you could think of it as kind of like a field guide to qualitative research, which is why I have this picture of pine cones. And these are the methodologies that are described in those slides. Okay, so that's it for what's packaged up. Now I have a few slides about rigor and quality. Yeah.
So I have a question. When you say that we all have a worldview, if people wanted to understand better what their worldview is, what resource might you recommend people go to?
So I think that probably those papers, the 3 references that I had, would be a good starting point, because there's lots of examples in there about the sort of variations between what does it mean if you're a constructivist thinker versus an interpretivist thinker. So that would be a good place. Because I mostly only teach qualitative methods, and so I've been looking for a long time for some kind of like quiz that would give people like some questions and be like a 15-minute, is this you or is that you? It's like one of those like BuzzFeed quizzes or something.
Yeah.
Oh, you're a constructivist. But I haven't found one, so correction. I haven't found one that I think is good. Yeah. So I don't unfortunately have something like that to suggest. But if I find one, I will let you know, because I am... periodically, I check and see if someone's created something like that. Good question. No? Good? Okay. So when we think about what are the markers of a good qualitative research project, what does rigor look like? How, if you're, like maybe you're doing a literature review for something and you come across some qualitative studies and you want to have an understanding about how credible the findings of those studies are, what does this look like? Well, the good news or the bad news is that there's no consensus in qualitative research about what good qualitative research looks like. Like we don't agree on this. And there's sort of three main camps in this argument, or in this controversy. And this controversy, I would say, has been going on since, I don't know if you could say qualitative research was invented, but since it kind of gained traction in the late 60s. Some people think that you can't evaluate qualitative research with sort of standard set from the beginning criteria, that it is impossible to make a checklist or a list of considerations that would work to evaluate a qualitative research study, that this is just philosophically impossible. For reasons of each methodology has its own criteria for rigor. Those criteria shift over time. There's a big disjuncture between what people report versus what they actually do. There's a disjuncture between what people do and the quality of the project. Like, those two things are not necessarily, like, there's no causal link between your procedures and the quality or the interesting originality of your findings. And so some people just resist the idea of appraisal of qualitative research or assessment at all. On the other side of the spectrum, so this blonde woman, there are some people that say all research should stand up to the same criteria, qualitative and quantitative, doesn't matter. There's going to be one list of what a good study looks like, and everybody's got to get in line if they want me to think that they are producing good research. Most qualitative researchers do not take that stance, but that is the stance of a lot of quantitative researchers who just kind of want to fit this into the same, into the hierarchy, the evidence pyramid, grade A, B, like that. You know what I'm talking about, right? We're at McMaster, we know about this.
So the CASP tools that give you critical appraisal tools for all the different types, they would have a tool.
They have a qualitative tool, yeah.
And so what you would, the guy
some people would not accept that.
You cannot.
No, they would say there's no point in using that CASP. It doesn't offer you any insights into quality. It's just a waste of your time.
Right.
But the middle woman would say, yes, sure, we can build some quality criteria that are specific to qualitative research, or even specific to a particular methodology within qualitative research, and we can use those criteria to assess the quality or the rigor of a particular study. And that, I think, is probably where, like, if we're thinking about the sheer numbers of qualitative researchers, probably most people who are engaging in this work sort of fall in that middle category. If we think about the sort of methodologists and the people that write a lot about qualitative research, they're probably a little bit over to this side. So it's more the applied health researchers that are happy to have some kind of checklist for rigor, and the, like, the big experts are skeptical of the credibility of those type of lists.
Because I'm just thinking the people who, so many people might start a study thinking about the methods, which you've clearly articulated is not the place to start. So if we're thinking of a broad audience of people who are not sort of the qualitative gurus, wouldn't a tool like that help for people who are looking at qualitative data and publications to know, and I don't actually know if you could tell from the analysis whether or not this study started with a method as opposed to with the
Right, and there's lots of those tools. So there's reporting standards, there's appraisal standards, like there's lots of things that have been built in that category to help you do that work. Like it's certainly available. Lots of, like I'm thinking of like clinical guidelines and health technology assessments that now integrate qualitative research, but absolutely require some kind of assessment of rigor to evaluate each of those studies. Like there's lots and lots of people that fall into that, like we need to assess the rigor of qualitative research. And there's lots of tools to help you do that. But there's still many people that remain skeptical about the usefulness. And there's also some really interesting studies that use like 3 different qualitative appraisal tools, the same list of say 10 or 20 qualitative studies, have people use different tools to appraise those same studies and then compare the different results. The different tools will say that different things are higher or lower quality as kind of an example of like, this is not perfect. Like what do we do with this? So here are some of the challenges with assessing rigor. There's no sort of unified paradigm of what qualitative research is, and there's no consensus on methods or standards for appraisal. I think I said before that usually people underreport their procedural details, and good procedures don't necessarily ensure a good product, and I'll talk about that in a little more depth. But the point is that high quality research beyond good procedures also requires sort of a prowess, like a conceptual analytical prowess. Like you can't just follow the steps and come out with a good study. Like there's something else. I always joke about like the magic of qualitative research, but there is something beyond procedures about making a good product. So some of the hallmarks of when we talk about rigor, and I guess I should maybe be explicit that when I'm talking about checklists and appraisal, even the people on this sort of anti-foundationalist, what did I call that guy? The non-foundationalist side of no, we can't, use a priori criteria. He's not saying that there's no way to think about quality, just that it's difficult for an outsider to take criteria that are already written or made it and apply to a study. Every single methodology has very specific details and understandings about the procedures or what you should be striving for to create quality research. And so when you are doing a study in your particular methodology, there's lots of ideas about what quality looks like in that methodology, what you can do to try to achieve that. And so the people, the non-foundationalist side of the argument is just saying that those two things don't mesh with a predetermined checklist, that it's hard to assess that effort. We're not saying that there's no standards or there's no procedures. And here are some of the things that are generally accepted across qualitative paradigms about what we can be striving for. So theoretically sophisticated findings, usefulness, resonance, originality, trustworthiness, credibility. And you notice these words are not validity, right? Like these are different different concepts than we would be striving for in quantitative research. Does anyone have any questions about like what these ideas mean or what it would look like? Yeah.
Originality, is that, could you explain more about that?
Sure. So that's sort of the idea that what's the point of doing something that's already been done that we already know about that's saturated in the literature? Novelness, novelty, I guess.
That should go across all research.
Pardon? Yeah, that would be across all research.
Can you explain also in that sort of broad way resonance also?
Sure. So resonance is, I guess, do you know the concept of gestalt? Like physicians sometimes talk about like their sort of holistic impression of something. I think the resonance could be a parallel concept for like when you're reading it, does it provide enough details and description that you can imagine what they're actually talking about? And if you have some kind of interface with that experience, if you're, have lived that experience yourself, or you have been a caregiver for someone who lived that experience, whatever your entree is into that, does that resonate with what you have experienced yourself in your own life? And sometimes you might be reading research that you have no experience for, and so you have a hard time, offering anything about resonance. And that's okay. So there's lots of different procedures that are offered by the various methodologies of how you might try to achieve those, and here are some of the kind of common ones, but again, it's very methodology specific, and so you would look to your methodological text for guidance on this. And then I have some books specifically about, or some slides specifically about critical appraisal, because, as I said, this is a talk that I usually give to the HRM group, and they're really interested in critical appraisal. So I don't know if this group is I don't know if any group is as interested in critical appraisal as the Health Research Methodology Program. But perhaps it's worth going through the basic concept that in evidence-based medicine and quantitative research, we kind of have this like a very sophisticated understanding of how to appraise quality, but it all relies on sort of the causal hypothesis testing research, and that there's assumptions that there's a hierarchy of better to worse designs that lead to better to worse quality of evidence, and so sometimes that gets transported into qualitative research, and it just doesn't fit quite as well. So there's this assumption from the quantitative group that the methods that are reported could warrant the results as true or not true, that there's something that we can learn about the strength of the conclusions from looking at the methods. Which absolutely would hold true for experimental research, for hypothesis testing studies, when you're doing research about something for which the causal mechanism is plausible and can be accounted for within the research, but it's mostly just doesn't fit with qualitative research. So if I can give you a metaphor of making a loaf of bread, and these slides are from my colleague Mita Giacomini, but I just really loved her metaphor, so I've borrowed them. So quantitative research is kind of like making bread in a very reliable bread machine, that you can specify the ingredients and the recipe and what that particular machine is, and anybody who's operating the machine should be able to get the same results. If they follow the recipe, they follow the procedures, they use the same ingredients, it shouldn't matter who's operating the bread machine, right? Like that person is just kind of removed from the whole process. It's the design and it's the procedures that really are going to tell you about the quality of those findings, right? This resonates with our understanding about quantitative research. Qualitative research is more like producing a perfect artisanal sourdough baguette, that if you gave a whole bunch of people the same ingredients and the same oven, you'll get a wide variety of results, that some people will produce something lovely and some people will produce like Play-Doh, right? Because what's the difference between Play-Doh and bread? Flour, water, salt. And so we can specify some aspects of the ingredients, so the data they're always going to be specific to the people that you talk to. They're never going to be the same twice, because you conduct the same study twice, you're going to be talking to different people who've had different experiences, different perspectives. The design is, sure, there's guidance and there's procedures that you could follow, but there's also a lot of decisions that need to be made within that particular project. So it will vary necessarily. If we talk about sort of like a machine, which would be the analysis, we could follow the same coding procedures, but what we identify, what we prioritize, how we label things, how we group things, those similarities that we see between concepts, that totally depends on the person who's doing that work. It depends on the baker, right? And so even following good procedures, you're going to get different results. And some of those results are going to be better than other results. And that's just kind of the way I think we have some more bread pictures here, the way of the world. But as a result, we need to judge the study on, if we are going to judge the study at all, which most people would say, yeah, you can make some judgments about the quality of the study, it's got to be as much on the findings and what they produced as on the procedures that they followed to get there. So I guess the bottom line of qualitative or any research is that no research project is ever going to be perfect. So if we're thinking about, appraising quality, nothing is going to be perfect, but what steps did they take to make it better? Does their project have more strengths than weaknesses? Did they acknowledge their limitations? Can you trust what they're saying? Is it relevant? Is it useful? Like these sort of broad questions are more helpful to us for assessing the quality of individual studies than like a predetermined checklist of do they mention research ethics approval? Did they have independent coders? Did they engage in member checking? Like those things, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. Probably not. Okay, so that's it. Here's my I don't know if you guys have ever seen PhD comics, but if you haven't seen it, highly entertaining for those of us who are engaged in the research enterprise. Yeah, done.